October 1943. A 12-year-old boy pedals his bicycle down a cobblestone street in occupied France, newspapers stacked in his front basket, his cap pulled low against the autumn wind. German soldiers wave him through their checkpoint without a second glance because he's just a kid delivering papers, harmless and insignificant, not worth their attention. They don't know he's counting their tank positions. They don't know he's memorizing the patrol schedule. They don't know that in 6 hours, he'll draw everything he's seen on a map that resistance fighters will smuggle to Allied intelligence, and in 2 weeks, Royal Air Force bombers will reduce those positions to smoking craters. The boy's name was Marcel, though the resistance only knew him by his code name, and he'd been gathering German military intelligence for 8 months without the occupiers suspecting a thing. He had the perfect cover because the Germans had made a calculated decision early in the occupation that children under 14 weren't threats, didn't have the skills or knowledge to be useful to the resistance, and letting them move freely actually made the occupation look more benign to the local population. They were wrong. Marcel had already mapped 67 German positions across 3 occupied towns, intelligence that would prove devastatingly accurate when Allied forces planned their bombing raids and the eventual liberation of the region. And here's the thing. This story gets even more insane, so if you're enjoying this, smash that subscribe button because we tell stories like this every single week. And trust me, you won't believe how this kid pulled off what trained intelligence officers couldn't. What makes Marcel's story so remarkable wasn't just his courage, but the system of intelligence gathering he developed that kept him alive while other resistance members were being arrested and executed all around him. His father had been a postal worker before the occupation, shot by the Germans for hiding resistance pamphlets in his mailbag, and his mother ran a small bakery that served as a meeting point for local resistance members who would slip information between loaves of bread. When the resistance needed someone who could move through German checkpoints freely, someone the soldiers wouldn't search or question, they realized Marcel was the answer because a boy on a paper route was invisible to an occupying army that saw children as irrelevant. The newspaper delivery job was legitimate, which made the cover perfect. Marcel worked for the local paper that the Germans actually approved of because it printed their propaganda and kept the population informed of occupation rules. So his route took him through areas that were otherwise restricted to civilians. He delivered to German officers billeted in confiscated homes, to the mayor's office where collaborators worked with the occupation government, and to businesses along the industrial district where the Germans had set up supply depots and motor pools. Every morning at 6, he'd load his bicycle and spend 3 hours riding through town, and the Germans got so used to seeing him that they'd joke with him at checkpoints and sometimes give him chocolate or cigarettes to take home. But while Marcel smiled and thanked them in broken German, he was counting everything. He developed a photographic memory through months of practice, training himself to notice details and hold them in his mind until he could transfer them to paper. When he stopped to rest his bicycle against a wall, he was actually studying the artillery pieces positioned behind a warehouse. When he bent down to tie his shoe, he was noting the number of trucks in a convoy passing by. When he fumbled with his papers and dropped a few, forcing him to stop and collect them, he was memorizing the guard rotation at a fuel depot. The Germans saw a clumsy kid. The resistance saw an intelligence goldmine. The specific information Marcel gathered was incredibly detailed and exactly what Allied intelligence officers needed to plan effective operations. He'd count the number of artillery pieces at each position and note their approximate caliber based on barrel length, something his resistance handlers had taught him to estimate. He tracked German patrol patterns down to the minute, noting which routes they took, how many soldiers were in each patrol, and what weapons they carried. He identified supply depots and noted what they stored, fuel drums, ammunition crates, vehicle parts, by watching what went in and out on trucks. He even tracked troop movements, counting how many soldiers would climb into trucks heading east or west, giving resistance fighters early warning of German reinforcements or repositioning. Every night after his route, Marcel would lock himself in his attic bedroom and draw maps from memory, his hands shaking from fear and exhaustion as he sketched street layouts and marked each position with symbols the resistance had taught him. He'd note the date and time of his observations, add details about guard strength and equipment conditions, and rate his confidence in each piece of information. Then he'd fold the maps into tiny squares, seal them in waxed paper to protect them from rain, and hide them in a hollow metal tube he'd attached under his bicycle seat. The next morning, during his route, he'd make a dead drop at one of 3 locations the resistance had established: behind a loose brick in a cemetery wall, inside a drain pipe near the river, or under a specific paving stone in an alley behind the church. The intelligence Marcel provided was so valuable that Allied commanders began planning operations specifically around his information because it was current, accurate, and covered areas that aerial reconnaissance couldn't photograph. In December 1943, his map of a German ammunition depot's layout and guard schedule allowed resistance fighters to plant explosives that destroyed 3 months' worth of artillery shells, an explosion so massive it shattered windows 2 miles away. In February 1944, his detailed notes about a tank repair facility's exact location and the number of disabled panzers being serviced there led to a precision bombing raid by American B-17s that destroyed 17 tanks that would have been operational again within weeks. In April, his observation that German patrols avoided a specific section of forest because the ground was too muddy for vehicles allowed resistance fighters to establish a hidden supply cache that supported guerrilla operations for months. But Marcel's work came with constant, stomach-churning danger that would have broken most adults. The Germans had made it clear that anyone caught spying, regardless of age, would be executed as an enemy combatant, and they'd already shot a 14-year-old boy in a neighboring town for carrying resistance messages. Marcel had at least 4 close calls where he nearly got caught, moments where his heart hammered so hard he thought the Germans could hear it. Once, a suspicious officer stopped him and dumped all his newspapers on the ground, searching for hidden messages while Marcel stood there trying not to shake, praying the officer wouldn't notice the hollow tube under his seat. Another time, he just made a dead drop when a German patrol rounded the corner unexpectedly, and he had to pretend he was urinating against the wall to explain why he'd stopped in that alley. The psychological toll on a 12-year-old doing this work was crushing in ways the resistance hadn't fully anticipated. Marcel couldn't tell anyone at school what he was really doing, couldn't share the fear that woke him up at night in cold sweats, couldn't explain why he flinched every time he heard German boots on cobblestones. He watched neighbors get arrested and dragged from their homes, wondering if someone had betrayed the resistance and if soldiers would come for him next. He saw what happened to captured spies, their bodies left hanging in the town square as warnings, and knew that could be him if he made one mistake, if a German soldier noticed him looking too long at a military installation, if his dead drop was discovered, if someone in the resistance network broke under torture and gave up his name. What kept Marcel going wasn't just courage, but a burning hatred for the Germans who'd killed his father and occupied his country, and he channeled that hatred into cold, methodical intelligence work. His resistance handler, a former school teacher codenamed Renard, later said that Marcel had the discipline and focus of a trained agent twice his age, that he never embellished his reports or guessed at information he wasn't certain about, and that his maps were so accurate that Allied intelligence officers initially didn't believe they came from a 12-year-old. In the 8 months Marcel operated, he produced 67 detailed intelligence reports covering German positions across a 30-mile radius, and Allied commanders estimated that his information contributed to operations that destroyed over 200 German vehicles, killed or wounded hundreds of soldiers, and disrupted occupation operations throughout the region. Marcel wasn't unique, which makes this story even more remarkable. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements recruited hundreds of children for intelligence work precisely because the Germans underestimated them so completely. In Belgium, a 10-year-old girl named Claire counted German trains passing through a rail yard and passed the information through coded messages hidden in her school homework. In Holland, twin brothers who sold flowers on the street memorized German officer conversations and reported them to resistance members who bought their flowers. In Poland, teenage boys working as messengers for German offices would photograph documents and pass copies to underground fighters. The German occupiers never imagined that the children they dismissed as insignificant were building an intelligence network right under their noses. When Allied forces finally liberated Marcel's town in August 1944, he'd been working for the resistance for 11 months and had just turned 13. American intelligence officers interviewed him extensively, amazed at the detail in his reports and the risks he'd taken, and several of his maps were included in official after-action reports about the liberation campaign. The colonel who debriefed him wrote that Marcel provided more accurate intelligence about German positions than several adult resistance cells combined, and that his work had directly contributed to the success of multiple bombing raids and sabotage operations that weakened German defenses before the Allied advance. Marcel survived the war, though he carried the psychological scars of what he'd done for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke about his work, even decades later, except to say that someone had to do it and he was in a position to help. His mother kept every one of his maps, storing them in a metal box that Marcel's grandchildren discovered after his death in 1998, and several of those maps are now in museums dedicated to the French resistance. Intelligence historians who've studied his work say that his observations were remarkably sophisticated for his age, showing an understanding of military logistics and tactics that suggested either natural talent or exceptional training from his resistance handlers. The Germans never caught Marcel, never suspected that the smiling boy who delivered their newspapers every morning was the source of intelligence that was systematically destroying their occupation infrastructure. They'd made the same mistake occupying forces have made throughout history, assuming that danger only comes from adults, that children lack the capability or motivation to resist, that youth equals innocence and irrelevance. Marcel proved them devastatingly wrong, and so did hundreds of other children across occupied Europe who gathered intelligence, carried messages, planted explosives, and fought back against an enemy that had dismissed them as harmless. By the end of the war, resistance networks across occupied Europe had recruited over 3,000 children as intelligence gatherers and couriers, and their contributions were so significant that Allied intelligence officers began specifically requesting information from child sources because they had access to areas and conversations that adult resistance members couldn't penetrate. The intelligence these children provided helped plan bombing raids, coordinate sabotage operations, track German troop movements, and ultimately contributed to the liberation of occupied territories, all because the Germans never imagined that a 12-year-old on a bicycle could be their most dangerous enemy. Thanks for watching this story from WW2 Vault about the child resistance fighters who gathered intelligence right under German noses. Next week we're covering the German tank commander who realized too late that American Shermans weren't what he expected. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and let us know in the comments if you've heard stories about child resistance members from your own family.